A biblical perspective on life, culture and current events. This is 2020 on Vision.
And over this next hour, an opportunity to talk about kids in church and more specifically some of the unique challenges of ministry kids. Now, you might appreciate that there's been much prodding and probing with special research into the well-being of pastors and church leaders. You might even say over the centuries, almost 2,000 years of the Christian church, the well-being of leaders has been an important focus, after even the Apostle Paul identified his own concerns for leaders who are not immune to stress and anxiety. But what about the children of our Christian leaders? Sometimes they're called PKs, or that sometimes is short for pastors' kids, but it's the kids of pastors or the kids of missionaries or the leaders of parachurch organisations. Well, these kids often face extra pressures, extra scrutiny and higher expectations than other kids. Well, researcher Valerie Ling has been focusing her attention on the impacts of pastoral life on children. Valerie Ling is a clinical psychologist leading the Centre for Effective Living and the Centre for Effective Serving. Valerie's joining us. Valerie, a special welcome back to 2020.
It feels great to be back, Neil. Thanks for having me.
Valerie, I love talking to you, and I'm just remembering last time we were talking, you were exploring the attitudes of church leadership to things like burnout and the fact that lots of pastors were even thinking of leaving the ministry. A lot of people don't think there's those sorts of stresses, but there are stresses on Christian leaders. But now you're turning your focus to ministry kids and the stresses that are on them.
I am. I think the main reason that we've done this is the first survey on how the ministry workers were doing. The top reasons for why they would have considered leaving the ministry, one was loneliness, the other was impact on their family and then the workload. So we were wondering if the ministry workers were feeling lonely and they were worried on the impact of the ministry on their family, well, has anybody asked the kids how they're doing? And that's how it started.
And to get a context for the overall way I think our conversation's going this morning, do most kids of pastors, do most ministry kids have a good experience or a bad one? That maybe that's polarizing two sides here, and maybe that's not the way to approach it. But what have you found? If you're looking at your research overall, do most ministry kids have a good experience or a bad experience?
I think most ministry kids really value serving the Lord Jesus Christ and his people with their families. I think they see it as being something that is precious and a privilege, and that they get the benefits of being a part of a faith community and having input from lots of adults. So I would say that this survey would suggest that the kids are generally content and happy to be part of their parents' ministry.
Of course, you might have some kids, I guess, on a roller coaster. Some weeks they feel great about being a pastor's kid. The next week, when they're under those pressures, they might not be feeling so great about that. So I imagine it can change very easily.
Yeah, and I think a couple of the kids, so the way that we designed the survey was there were a couple of tick box type questions, so sort of just rate your answers, and then a whole bunch of just tell us in your own words. And I think a couple of kids actually did say that, look, what we need you guys to understand is sometimes it's great, sometimes it's not. There are a mixed bag of experiences, and so about 2/3 of the children said being a ministry kid is great, and about a third were not sure to definitely not great.
Hey, what about including in our conversation today all of those listeners who are not connected to the pastor by way of being their child, never been a pastor's kid, never even considered ever at all that there might be some special pressures or stresses or even mental health issues that pastors' kids might have to deal with, different to other kids in church. How do you think your research is really relevant too for people who are a part of church, but they're not necessarily connected to the pastor in that way?
Well, being a pastor is one of those unique vocations where your entire family is actually brought into the ministry or the work context. And so the children are exposed to, in the minute, on the ground effects of what the parents are dealing with. Now, even if parents aren't telling their kids what stresses are happening, children are really very good at picking up the emotional signature of their parents. And what we've found is that the kids are actually saying that our parents are, they have a lot of work, they're busy, there are a lot of meetings, and if there is, something that we could change about that is we'd love to have more time with them. Some of the other things that they told us was that as a ministry kid, when you go to school or when you have your friends, you're not quite sure how to explain what your parents do. There's an awkwardness, and I think there's also a bit of a social stigma now for, Christianity and church, and for some of the older kids, they're aware of some of the sad leadership falls that have happened in church spaces. And so for children, when they go to school, it's hard for them to explain what their parents do.
Now, you're a clinical psychologist, Valerie, and
Yes.
that means that you have had lots of face-to-face contact, and you particularly do like to deal with Christian leaders. And so those face-to-face communications, and no doubt sometimes when the worst situations have arisen, and the effects on an individual, of course, have a ripple effect onto spouses and children.
Absolutely.
So when you've been in your role as clinical psychologist, you've been able to explore how families have been reacting even when there are not so good times happening.
Oh, absolutely. So for younger children, they tend to assume that they've got to do better. Their parents, they want to have their parents back, so they believe that maybe they have to behave better. Maybe they shouldn't feel sad or angry or anxious because mom or dad could lose their job, like if that gets out. So for younger kids, we find that they tend to internalize those responsibilities and expectations. For the older kids, I think it comes into a faith intersection of seeing, well, we're all part of God's body and God's church, so why do we have this level of conflict? It's harder for them to reconcile the face of Jesus through the church, through what they see happening in the church, to the face of Jesus that they know and love. So I think we found in our study that older children felt the impact of their parents' ministry more than younger kids.
Interesting, isn't it, when you begin to reflect on the work that a pastor might do in church. And for a lot of people who think the pastor just visits people and eats scones with jam and cream and drinks cups of tea with a pinky raised, that's somewhat far from the truth, because pastors are often dealing with some really challenging situations in families within their own church, and they bear a great burden on their shoulders. And what you're saying here is that kids are actually picking up, if they don't know the details, because those things are often confidential, pastors can't talk about those, but they've picked up the vibe, haven't they? The vibe of how their parents might be dealing with some of the circumstances and situations that develop in church life.
That's right. I mean, equally, I think you will hear from the children's comments. They also believe that they get front row tickets to God's goodness. The miraculous things that He does, the really spectacular joys of seeing people come to Christ, or seeing a particular relationship take a turn. But that also means that you're absolutely right. Pastors can't actually talk about many of the pastoral things that are happening in the church. And so when they come home, They could be burdened, they could be withdrawn, they could be very preoccupied, and kids pick up on that.
And I should just mention too that while you're a clinical psychologist, you're also married to a pastor and you're leading a large team of psychologists in your Sydney organisations, those ones that I mentioned there in the introduction, the Centre for Effective Living, the Centre for Effective Serving, married to a pastor. So when you're doing this sort of research, Valerie, a lot of that is sort of first-hand gleanings too, isn't it?
Yes, and our children were particularly interested to see the survey go out because I think kids, what can they actually talk about? Is it okay to say that, I'm not doing all right as a ministry kid? And since the results have come back, my own children are processing their experiences, talking to us about things that have happened we didn't know about. We just were unaware that they were internalizing some things that they thought were expectations on themselves were not necessarily things that we expected, but that's just what they made sense of for themselves.
Okay, you had ministry kids respond to a survey. You surveyed 100 children, as I understand it, between the ages of 10 and 14, so the average age about 12 years. What sort of questions were you asking, Valerie?
Well, actually, it was broader than that. So the kids were from year 3 to year 12, but the average age was between 10 to 14, so a 12-year-old would have been average. Well, first of all, we put a typical inventory of depressive anxiety and stress symptoms. So we really did want to know what the mental health statistics of the kids were. And then we looked at some other research on adult ministry kids reflecting back on their experiences. So we asked them about things like loneliness, relationships with their parents, how connected they felt with their faith community, and then asked them basically to help us to understand what the challenges are for them and what can help to make it better.
Now, we've been talking primarily probably about what happens in a local church here in an Australian setting, but your research goes beyond just the local church and even onto the mission field, where kids are taken and sometimes dragged to different places around the world, and all of a sudden they're immersed in a different culture and all sorts of challenges that go along with being a ministry kid in a mission context. Is it even more significant to be able to appreciate some of the pressures here?
Oh, definitely. So we had about 40 kids who identified as being in cross-cultural mission with their family. Definitely the issues of moving, disruption on friendships, and feeling on the outside when it comes to friends. That was a theme that came out for our kids in the field.
Okay, we are talking about ministry kids, and I do want to open our talkback line. You might like to contribute. Maybe you are a ministry kid. You grew up with pastors as parents. Maybe you're a pastor, or you might be someone who's contemplating a career serving God, maybe even in a missionary context. You might be thinking, well, I think I'd like to take our family, we'll uproot everything here and we'll go overseas and we'll take the kids. Oh, they'll just fit in fine. Maybe you'd like to join in our conversation today. You might have a special question to ask our special guest today. Valerie Ling is a clinical psychologist, and we're talking about her research into ministry kids. 1-800-316-316 if you'd like to join our conversation. We're back with more with Valerie in just a few moments.
Vision Christian Radio bumper stickers are a practical way to show the world how much you love Vision. New stickers are available now. Choose the I Love Vision sticker or your local frequency and proudly display your affiliation with Australia's national Christian radio network. It's more than just a sticker, it's a statement and might help someone you'll never meet discover Vision and start looking to God daily. Whether you're parked or cruising through town, Vision bumper stickers will turn heads and spark conversations. Stick it, show it, and let everyone know you're tuned to Vision. Available now at vision.org.au/stickers. Order your Vision bumper sticker today.
Ready for a life-changing journey? Walk in the footsteps of Apostles Paul and John, exploring biblical sites like Athens, Ephesus and Philippi with Vision Tours. Have your faith deepened as you visit Corinth's ruins and sacred sites at Patmos. Join Ian and Mandy Warby in March 2025 for an unforgettable biblical odyssey. The first 30 to book save $300. Visit vision.org.au/tours to secure your place.
Katoomba Christian Convention is all about bringing you life-changing Christian events and solid Bible teaching that helps you grow your faith. But now, with the KCC One app, you can experience the impact of KCC events every day. Stay up to date with all the events happening at Katoomba Christian Convention. Enjoy daily encouragement and never miss another talk from the speakers you love again. Download the KCC One app from your app store or head to kcc1.org.au. Station sponsor.
Helping you make sense of life, culture and current events from a biblical perspective. 2020 on Vision.
And our talkback line open on 1800 316 316. We're talking about ministry kids. Sometimes they're referred to as PKs or pastors' kids. And I must say, Valerie, Ling, when we talk about pastors' kids, I've heard it said this way, and, I can appreciate it's like a no-win situation sometimes for pastors' kids, because if they're the best behaved kids in church, it's because they're the pastor's kids. And if they're the worst behaved kids in church, it's because they're the pastor's kids. In some sense, there is a no-win situation, but that's part of the pressure, isn't it?
I think so. And I think that's why we've got to take an individualized approach to it. Every child's going to be different. What I think helps, though, is when we ask, how are we doing taking care of you? What would be great for you to see your time with us, easier, if you like?
Let's talk about some of the findings, Valerie. We mentioned already things like busyness. There's all sorts of expectations about being at church all on time, every time, and never missing Sunday, all those sorts of things. What sort of things are prominent in your mind as we talk about the findings of your research?
Yeah, I think there was a mention of an assumption that they have all the right Bible answers. So some kids may like being called on to give the right answer, but some ministry kids may really not want to. They may want to blend in. For some of them, they may be genuinely struggling with questions or uncertainties in their faith. So I think one thing that is different for ministry kids, whether they're on the field or in church, is the assumption that they know their Bible really well and being the default kid to call on.
So if your dad or your mum is the great Bible teacher, then they expect that to sort of somehow or other pass through in a genetic type of way onto the kids. And some kids are predisposed quite nicely to being appreciative of understanding, remembering chapter and verse, but lots of kids are not. So you've just got to have that little bit of extra leeway to understand that not all kids are going to be the same Bible encyclopedia knowledge as their parents.
Well, and personality comes in. So I think sometimes there can be an assumption that the whole ministry family loves being leadership and limelight. But that may not be true. You may get, a home full of, siblings. One of them may be like that. One of them may not at all. So it goes to personality as well, having an understanding of, with what each of the children, what their temperaments are like and, what's going to suit them and what's going to terrify them.
Some of the other findings, kids being displaced regularly, moving house, and it's going to be different for different churches, different denominations, different families, but that's one of the issues that came up.
Yes, this one was very interesting. I mean, we have to say that on average, it was the kids in the field that the impact of moving was probably felt stronger. But we did find that pastors' kids who had moved from different suburbs or different churches also talked about the cost of moving. For the ministry kids in general, it's the cost of their friendships, having to say goodbye and anticipating that maybe the place that they're in now will not be for long. And so being stumped about whether they can actually invest in their current friendships. Will there be why invest when you're just going to say goodbye in a few years?
What about the thought that kids have stricter rules than their friends when they're pastors' kids? Is this something that's quite relevant?
Yes, I think it is. I mean, anecdotally, in our practice, we probably see that kids in ministry have, I don't know whether censorship is the right word, but there are heavier restrictions on the things that they listen to, they read, and they watch. The kids in their comments also talked about, Saturday, Sunday, even Friday night being the times when most kids of their age would hang out, go for parties, or go to the beach, and they were at church.
And you tend to think that kids are under that stricter regime, almost can feel as though they're the weird ones in their friendship groups.
Yeah, I think some of the comments that came up for the survey suggested that. I don't think that the children were necessarily in their comments saying that they wanted to push against those rules. I think what we got a sense of was, please understand that it's not easy for us. It's not, we're trying to fit in, we're trying to make friends, but we've also got these different sets of expectations and rules than what our friends have. So we'd just like some understanding. And I think one of the things that came up was for them to feel like they weren't being judged. If they ask to go somewhere, or if they talk about a song that a friend's listening to, it doesn't mean that they're now signed on to secular culture. They're just having a conversation about it.
Let me just pause and get your reflection here for a moment, Valerie, because when we're talking about ministry kids, pastors' kids, some will be thinking, well, those kids are role models for other kids in church. How does that sort of play out? Because there'd be lots of families who are looking for kids of pastors to perhaps be a role model because their kids are looking for someone to, as a peer group, and perhaps even some positive peer group pressure for those sorts of things to happen. But again, that's a pressure on the pastor's kids. And are you saying that that's a sort of almost an unhealthy thing to have that expectation on them?
Yeah, look, I think, it goes an individualized approach, right? There are going to be some kids who would prefer to just blend in and not have those sorts of pressures. And there are going to be some kids who you see them, they'll go for being sports prefect or house captain. If they have those natural tendencies to want to lead, then, that's going to suit them better. But I don't know that ministry kids thrive in an environment where they're looked at and singled out as being special. It's almost like they've got a job, but they just want to be regular kids.
And yet, in some sense, depending on home life, and, home life can be chaotic in a pastor's household as much as it can be chaotic anywhere. You've got this sort of expectation on leadership developing, and I imagine that it does. Now, is this one of the positives that you might find in ministry kids? If you've got kids who've been exposed to the good, the bad, and sometimes the ugly, that sometimes that actually helps to build into them some character and leadership traits.
Well, I think it gives them a more rounded awareness of the world. I don't know that they necessarily want to have an upfront leadership role, but they're certainly more insightful. I just interviewed Barnabas Piper, who's John Piper's son, this week for our podcast. And he was talking about how there's this sense that you've heard your father preach 1,000 times. Everything is very thorough. You have a level of knowledge and understanding, but you're also listening to things that are in the world that your friends aren't listening to, and there's a privilege to that. So I think they do have the potential to engage in issues and have an awareness that can lend themselves to being leaders. That, again, I think we need to ask them whether that's something that they want to do. Some of them are very happy tagging along with their parents and being little assistants or helpers. That gives them a deep satisfaction, but it's still in the background,
So some are going to go along with that quite nicely. Others might be a little rebellious against that because they have to be at church, or they have to be at youth group on Friday night, or they have to be at the Bible study, and sometimes it's the fact that they never have a weekend off. Does that affect the kids in any way?
Yes, I think that did come out in the survey. I think there's a sense that it's always switched on. I think a couple of the kids actually wrote and said, if the parents could have more holidays, just to be relaxed and chilled. So I think there is a sense that what is the weekend for them? It's actually like having another job, actually.
And having to be at all of those church events, do the kids feel like, I think we touched on this a little earlier, but you might like to enlarge on this, and whether this is a healthy thing or not, that kids always feel like they're on display, that they're being watched.
Yeah.
And I imagine that the downside is that they might be feeling like they're constantly being judged. How do you reflect on that?
Yeah, I think it's particularly important to reflect on one of the things that the survey picked up was that older children and also girls were more likely to be impacted by feeling different and the impact of their parents' ministry. Nobody likes to be looked at, right? You know, we talk about the goldfish effect. None of us, some of us would like to go out and everybody looks at us, but most of us, you know, you walk into a group setting or you walk into people that you don't know very much, you really don't want to stand out. You just want to blend in. And so I think it would be really fantastic for our faith communities to understand that every ministry kid that you have in your church, even if they're siblings, are having a really different experience of what it's like to be known. Like everybody knows you, but they don't really know you. And to be given the opportunity to be checked in on, maybe even develop a couple of one-on-one friendships with, an older peer, and to be asked, how are you going, and what would be helpful for you? Do you prefer to sit at the back? Do you prefer to sit in the front? What can we do so that this experience is a little bit easier on you? Because as you said, Neil, you don't really get a choice as a ministry kid.
Hey, Valerie, let's come to this concept of roast pasta for a few moments. Is this one of the things? Not everybody has a roast for Sunday lunch these days. Some families a bit more traditional, they do, but that whole saying came out of the thought that everyone sits around the table on Sunday and takes to pieces the church and the pastor. How does that affect the kids of the ministry family?
Yeah, look, it didn't come out in the survey, but it certainly comes out in the practice where we're seeing kids. I think we forget that children pick things up. They can see it. Like if a ministry kid is sitting at the back of the church, they can see all the body language. They can hear the little whispers. They're watchful. They can see the eyes rolling. And I think congregants also forget. Sometimes we may have these conversations on the fly, criticizing the minister or the sermon and not realizing that the kids are within earshot. So I think it does happen.
I guess for everyone listening, this is not typically the pastor's family, but this is for all the other families who are a part of church life. You've got to watch your P's and Q's. You've got to be careful of the way that you talk about issues that are going on in church life, because not only does it affect the family of the minister who might be in charge, but it also affects the way your perceptions are being passed on to your own children. Is that a challenging thing that you come across from time to time?
Yeah, so I think, there was a kid that said to us, not from the survey, but when their parent got inducted, they thought that they were also being inducted to forever be very good and well-behaved children, and that if they misbehaved, their parents would lose their jobs. This is something that's very common for missions kids as well. The fear that if they cause their parents any trouble or they're not well behaved, it could cost their parents their job. So I think part of the thing is for kids who are in ministry, the finances are not great. They know that, right? Because they've got parents who are trying to make the budget, the meal plans work and things like that. And so they can really internalize a sense of, oh, my dad's job or my parents' job is on the line. And that's a reality for ministry kids.
I mean, behaviour is one thing because there's an external behaviour, isn't there? And then there's what's going on in the processing in that little mind, or what's happening on the inside that might be breeding all sorts of, rebellion ready to break out. Some might even argue that there's a positive influence on behaviour if there's that higher expectation. Does that align with, is there, if you have this higher expectation and your behaviour on the outside is better, is that a good thing?
No. I think for psychologists, we talk about attunement. So it's the middle bit that's really important. Regardless of what external behavior a child is showing, it's never really reflective of what's truly going on in their inner world. And so the ability for parents to have the space, the emotional capacity, and the courage to check in with their children and say, hey, that explosion that happened in church this Sunday, that's really not like you. Well, what's happening? What was that about? What's going on at school? Or, is there something really troubling and bothering you? I think it's part of the challenge of parenting in ministry is to ourselves not be feel like our parenting is on show, so that we can have the patience and the emotional generosity to come back and check with our kids to inquire as to what's going on.
And if the kids are not processing things in the right way, I imagine, end scenario, ministry leaders sometimes losing their kids if they're not careful. If the expectations are too high. That might even beg the question, how much expectation is the right expectation? Is that something you do with your, in communication with the kids?
Well, because, you see, all children, whether they're in ministry or not, their brains are going to go through a period, particularly in adolescence, where some of the responsible parts of the brain goes offline. You almost get this dinosaur version of a kid come out. And that's normal and developmentally appropriate. And that can be expressed in many ways. For some kids, they become a lot more anxious. For some kids, they may become a lot more angry. It really depends on their temperament and just how they're expressing that period of development. But in ministry, we can really, the time when children are on display are the school-age years. And we can really come down on them like a ton of bricks and break the relationship that we have with them. And then by the time their brains come online again, sort of 25, age 25, or, when they're having kids of their own, and you've got this lovely opportunity now to repair and reflect, we may have lost that ground because we burned the bridges, if you like.
I guess you're describing some of these kids as actually at different points being quite fragile. And we might actually say that in all of our family situations, whether you're in a pastoral leadership family or you're a family that's a part of church, you've got to be able to look out for those fragilities and be able to have some sort of tools in the tool chest to be able to meet those fragile moments and strengthen those fragile moments. Would that be a fair way of saying this is how you've got to prepare and be ready?
Absolutely, and you'll know this, Neil. This season of the child's life goes like in a blink. The first 12 years goes quickly, and then till 18 it goes quickly. But they're very often the most intense, the most tiring, and the most scrutinized years as well. So if we can hold that perspective and go, do you know what? If we pull back, invest well, get equipped, have the hard conversations now, this season of life will not be forever. And then you get this lovely opportunity to have an adult relationship with our kids that, can go on for much longer.
Let's come back to some of these findings in your survey of 100 kids, year 3 to year 12. These are children of ministry parents. And one of the issues you discovered was around loneliness. Oftentimes, the kids of pastors, of ministers, of missionaries can really sense an intense loneliness. How does that look?
Yeah, so about half the kids said, I definitely don't feel lonely, and about the other half said, yeah, look, I'm kind of lonely, sort of lonely, definitely lonely. I think that could be the age of the children. So, the average age of the child was 12. So we unfortunately didn't ask them what was accounting for loneliness, but our hypothesis could be that when you're a little kid, you're pretty reliant on your family relationships to give you a sense of togetherness. It could be the moving aspect of ministry, having to make new friends, particularly for kids in the field. It could also just be not being able to connect with regular kids because of all the things we've talked about. So I think there's and the loneliness scores were related to lower mental health outcomes, or lower mental health scores in the kids as well.
Okay, so there's going to be some kids more vulnerable to that loneliness than others.
Yeah.
Hey, take us into this overseas kids again for a moment, because so many who might even be listening in right now contemplating some sort of overseas missionary activity, and you uproot the family and you take them into a different cultural context. Some of the challenges that kids face when they're on the mission field with their parents and disconnected from their family and friends back home, perhaps not as much these days with, FaceTime and things like that, with things back home, but this disconnect from Australian culture. How does that go for kids who are kids of missionaries?
Well, it's a bit of a double-edged sword. So in an age now where you can go on TikTok or YouTube or Instagram and all of that, the kids actually now are very well aware of what they're missing out on when they're on the field. They're aware of what their cousins are doing, what their old classmates are doing, and so they know that they're missing out on that. I think there's also a sense of kids now have an awareness that they're not really vibing with the atmosphere of the food when they're on the field. Yeah. You can go on social media now and see this amazing things that everybody else is eating, and then you go, well, this is what I've got. So I think we can't minimize it. I think it's the new age of mission. For kids in the field, I think one of the things that came out was they would love to feel more connected to their extended family in Australia. So making inroads for them to remain connected with cousins, aunts, uncles, grandparents.
Now, we've been talking about a lot of these findings and some of the unique things that have come out in your survey when you've been talking with and surveying ministry kids. What we might be interested in is when these kids are getting to those teenage years and they get to make their own decisions, they get to choose their own role models, and sometimes they look rather different to their parents' values. Do pastors' kids go through any particular special time, or is there anything different about the sorts of rebellion or need for detachment that pastors' kids have that might be different to other families at some point in their lives?
I don't have the stats to that, but I can certainly see that there is probably for some kids a need to, in what we call as psychologists, individuate. All children have to separate out from their parents, right? When you're in a non-ministry situation, you separate out from the parents by saying, I don't like your music. I'm going to listen to this loud music. When you're a ministry kid, though, that individuation includes what I think about what the Bible says about this issue, or what I think what this social issue that you think is, wrong, but I actually have a strong opinion about. I think that's where the kids in ministry, it's particularly challenging. And one of the great things that I've enjoyed since we've put out this result is adult ministry kids who are out in the world now working or doing whatever, saying to me, hey, I should reach out to my pastor's kid at church. Maybe they could do with someone like me to talk to sort of rough it out and say all the things that they disagree with or that they're upset with, because I'll get it.
Yes, there's a special relationship. If you've been a pastor's kid, you might have a special lookout for the pastor's kids who are in church in a new generation. Hey, I want to spend a few minutes talking about some of the things that we might take away from a conversation like this, because if ministry kids have special challenges, how do we deal with those? And maybe the way to approach that could be to ask, what do the kids want their parents to know about them, and do the kids want other people in church to know about them as pastors' kids? So how do we approach the sorts of things that you would say would be a takeaway for someone listening to our conversation now about some of these special challenges that pastors' kids face?
There's a beautiful quote directly from one of the kids. I'll read it out here. The kid said, what would help make your life better? And they said, a church community that treats us equally to the other kids. Parents that don't allow their stress from ministry affect how they treat their kids. And a ministry team that are patient and kind to one another and serve each other well so that less stress and anger would be put on their ministry parents. That would really help ministry parents to love their kids well.
Yeah.
So well said.
Yes, it is. And so when we're then just sort of working that out into how this looks across the calendar or each week and how things work out, I think we talked a little earlier about the fact that sometimes kids have got to be at church every Sunday, and then there's the youth group and there's the Bible study, and one of the things, as I understand it, that kids would like their parents to know is that how about a bit of flexibility in here?
Yeah.
How does flexibility look?
Flexibility, I think kids were basically saying, parents, we need to know that you've got our back, that you won't care what other people think if we don't turn up every now and again to youth group, or if we, every now and again don't hang around after church to help. Like, if we know that you've got our backs, then we feel we can ask you these sorts of things and say, all right, if, I do this Sunday a little bit differently. I think there's probably a sense that for church communities to maybe even just thank kids. I think very often ministry kids get the criticism of the behavior or the side glances, but it would be really nice, I think, if we got used to actually encouraging ministry kids, sitting down with them, making space and time for them over morning tea, inviting them around during school holidays if they want to chill out and hang out, just to normalize that they are regular kids. They can be regular kids and everybody will accept them.
You mentioned a little earlier that some of the pressures on ministry kids from their peers or even from adults in church life might be that they're always expected to have the right answers. And how do you deal with having a special, place where they can express their own doubts and ask their own questions? Is that something that is necessary for ministry kids?
Yes. Well, this is now my opinion. I think, having done this survey, I think some intentionality, how parents can learn to tune in and communicate with their kids. But the parents may find it difficult to deal with the doubts or the questions that their children may have about their faith. And that's why maybe working to find some spaces, if they're, a godparent, an aunt, a grandmother, someone within your networks that you can have a conversation with and say, hey, would you disciple or minister or encourage my child? Would there be a possibility that our families meet together, for example, and you become another adult figure in their lives? I think that could be something very beneficial for ministry kids.
There's a little old saying, you've probably heard it, Valerie, but for listeners, sometimes you might hear pastors telling lots of stories about their own children during the sermon. And,
yes.
There's this sort of saying, having kids means you've got a lifetime of sermon illustrations. But how do kids relate to that? Do they like the fact that dad or mum might be referring to them in a sermon, or do they resent it?
A couple of the kids did raise that and said, please don't do that. And again, I think we've got to ask our kids, right? Everything goes with asking. Like, there may be a particular story that they're happy for you to share, and there may be a particular story that they're not happy for you to share. And then how frequent does that happen? So I think that goes around a conversation of privacy. I think that did come up in the survey comments. And it's not just been called out in sermons, but there's always people at home. Their rooms being given up for guests. Lots of people know, like one of the missions kids said, I reckon there are about 100 pictures of me on people's fridges all over Australia. They seem to know me and I know nothing about them. There's this sense of being exposed, I suppose.
And as you say, sometimes the kids giving up their room or their bed for special guests, and sometimes the house of pastors can be, have revolving doors, people coming and people going all the time. Privacy, is this some sort of something special that we need to have consideration for kids who are in ministry?
Yeah, I think be aware of how regularly that happens and how unpredictable it is, because nobody likes things to be sprung on them, and be caught by that. So I think being aware that this is not something they can go and talk to their friends and say, hey, how do you guys deal with it? They'll be like, that doesn't happen to us. So, I think it's about being respectful of how often these things are happening, and then having a family conversation to say, what signals might be needed, what permissions can we have? Do we always have to stick around, or is there ever an okay time for us to just be in our rooms?
And just quickly, Valerie, I mean, it's sort of obvious, I think, to most that if you're in leadership in your church, having somewhere to go if you need some special counselling is useful. But, as a clinical psychologist, and you're leading the Centre for Effective Living, the Centre for Effective Serving, is there services available around Australia, or does this happen in your practice, where there's special counselling for pastors' kids? Does this happen?
Oh, there absolutely is. And one of the things that I'd love to say to parents, and not just parents in ministry, but Australia is really blessed with things like Kids Helpline, that a child can go and have a chat with someone if they're feeling a bit low or a bit down. I really want to encourage parents to have a conversation with their kids that says, look, if you're having a hard time and it's too hard to come to me, here are a couple of numbers, or here are a couple of helplines that you can access, right? And just be able to talk things out. At the same time, school counsellors can be a fantastic resource for kids as well. I think children just don't know whether they're going to get in trouble or if that's okay for them to do. So if we normalise that, I think that can go a long way.
So helplines, school counsellors, in fact, parents, and this is whether you're a ministry parent or not a ministry parent, just being able to resource your kids with someone trustworthy that they can talk to, no doubt is a real benefit when they're especially getting into those teenage years and they're pushing some boundaries and looking for direction and purpose. Well, Valerie, great getting your insights. And I know you have your Clergy Wellbeing Down Under podcast. Do you deal with any of these issues about kids in your podcast?
Yes, season 2, which is current, is especially dedicated to them. And we will have Colin Buchanan finish up and actually have a word to the kids themselves. So yes, it's for the kids.
Wow, a great alignment too with the great Colin Buchanan. Hey, the podcast or on YouTube, you've got a YouTube channel. You can also get some links to download the report that we're talking about, this survey of 100 ministry kids. And you can certainly Google or access that Clergy Wellbeing Down Under podcast. It's the podcast that is led by Valerie Ling, who's a clinical psychologist. She leads the Centre for Effective Living and the Centre for Effective Serving. I'll give the website for the effectiveserving.com.au. So effectiveserving.com.au, and you'll be able to connect with Valerie. Valerie leads a large team who are working on all sorts of issues around her clinical psychology practice. Valerie, thank you so much for sharing your thoughts and your heart with us today on 2020.
Oh, it's been a pleasure. Thank you so much, Neil, for having me.
Thanks for taking time to listen to this audio on demand from Vision Christian Media. To find out more about us, go to vision.org.au.